You're listening to the Dibbly-Dobbly podcast. Remember to like, share, comment, subscribe, and click the bell to make sure you get the latest episodes of the podcast. Be sure to like and share our Facebook page and follow us on Twitter and on Instagram. To finish off our discussion today, Andrew, for our last topic, let's talk about the Ashes, seeing that the Ashes are coming up later this year in England. Andrew, you would agree the Ashes is full of history, which stretches over 141 years since 1882. And it's a long, rich cricketing history, really, over the years between Australia and England and Ashes battles. So, Andrew, how important is it to preserve and tell the story about the Ashes, especially to up-and-coming cricket fans who may be just discovering Test cricket or the game of cricket in general?
Well, it's a romantic tale, and it just shows how nations have come together. It shows, in the case of Bodyline in the 1930s, how nations nearly fell apart. But it does show the strong links between the two nations. As I say, it is a romantic story. And to go back to the test at the Oval in the summer of 1881, we have to actually just consider some quite important parts of English social history, and in particular the fact that the thriving, the teeming Victorian cities were running out of space for traditional graveyards and places of burying bodies. Now, without going into all the gory details, during the late 1870s and the early 1880s, cremation became an accepted way rather than burying a body. And it was very much in the news during the 1881 Ashes series, and the victory of the Australian team at the Oval, which probably would have, for the traditional English men and women who were watching, this was, oh my word, these colonials winning on English soil. So a newspaper printed a mock obituary of English cricket. And at the bottom, it said the body will be cremated and the ashes will be taken to Australia. That little line then in keeping with what was happening, as I said, in terms of the disposal of bodies within Victorian cities in the UK. Well, to then take that story on a year, the Honourable Ivo Bligh, captaining then the England team the following winter out in Australia, and he met in various parts of Melbourne a lovely lady who he fell in love with, and the English team, the players, happened to play a very light-hearted game in the grounds of the house where this lady happened to be a music teacher. And having met and fallen in love with Ivo Bligh, the captain of the England team, she basically wanted to just, obviously in those days, say thank you to him and give him as something as a keepsake. Now, people aren't quite sure whether the bottle that she chose, the terracotta urn, as it were, was it a perfume bottle? Probably, from her lady's chamber. And what was inside? Well, did they burn a ball? Did they burn a bale? Did they burn something else? But they pasted onto the little urn. They had this newspaper article and again pasted on it the words, the ashes were used, and the lady handed over to Ivo Bligh this little urn. Now, he kept it. The story goes that on the long journey by ship back to the UK, there was only one thing on his mind, and that was actually this lovely lady that he just met. When he got back to the UK, he asked his father permission to marry this lady. Of course, permission was given, and she travelled to the UK. They had a large family, and it was only then in the 1920s that this little urn was discovered at the home of the Bligh family. By then he was Lord Darnley. And when they were going through his artifacts, his children said, "Oh, look, isn't this a lovely romantic story, how mum and dad got together, etc., etc." And so they decided in the late 1920s to present the urn to the MCC. So those early games up until then between England and Australia weren't really Ashes test matches. It was only after the donation of the urn to the MCC that people thought, no, wouldn't that be a lovely little trophy for this series between England and Australia? So that's the background to the Ashes. So it's a love story, but it's also, again, celebrating everything that is proper and right about going about things, asking permission, etc., things like that. And there's a little bit of humour there as well. But what a lovely romantic story.
Absolutely. And what people tend to forget is that the Ashes urn is not a trophy. It's a symbol of love. It's a, as you said, with Ivor Bligh and Florence Murphy.
Absolutely. Florence Murphy, I think they had 7 children, and Florence, rather than calling it Florence's Cup or the Lord Darnley Trophy, but just call it the Ashes. Isn't that lovely?
It is. It is. It's quite an interesting story. You mentioned Bodyline, Andrew, and let's talk about that. One of the most difficult periods of Ashes Bodyline in 1932-33, where England captain Douglas Jardine devised the tactic to contain the genius that was Sir Donald Bradman. Jardine, apparently watching some footage of Bradman in the 1930s Ashes series during the test match of the Oval, he saw Bradman looking a bit uncomfortable batting against short pitch bowling. And apparently Jardine leapt up and called out, "I've got it, he's yellow." From there, the notion of leg theory involving short pitch bowling was developed and setting a dominant leg side field. The years that followed, the laws were changed and you can't have more than 2 fielders behind square on the leg side. Otherwise, it's a no ball. And that sort of stemmed from what happened in Bodyline, obviously. I can see why Jardine devised the tactic, because in 1930, Bradman had a wonderful series. He scored 974 runs, which remains a record for the most runs to be scored in an Ashes series and also in a Test series. At an average of 139, 4 centuries, highest score of 334, which he got at Headingley, scored 300 of those runs in a day. The only batter in test matches to score 300 runs in a day. He scored 254 at Lords in that series as well, which he considered that innings to be his best in test matches, Sir Don. So for Jardine to find a weakness to expose must have given England hope when they toured Australia in 1932-33, and Jardine was determined to win the Ashes back, which he was successful in that series because England won 4-1 of the best of 5. And obviously Jardine previously toured Australia. He was there in 1928-29, the English side that won the Ashes that series, and also played in Don Bradman's first ever test match along with Harold Larwood. England won by big margins. They won the first test in Sydney by 10 wickets. Australia bounced back in Melbourne in the second test. They won by 11 runs. The third test match in Adelaide, England won by 338 runs. The fourth test in Brisbane, England won by 6 wickets. And the last test in Sydney again, England won by 8 wickets. And it was a very controversial series indeed. But it did have an effect on Bradman himself. He only scored 396 runs at an average of 56, 1 century and 3 50s. Not a bad series for any batter, but in terms of Bradman's standards in Test cricket, very poor, unlike in 1930. He didn't play the first Test due to illness. He only came back for the second Test After missing the first test, he scored a century. He batted for over 185 minutes, and that's where he scored that century in Melbourne. So he got out for a golden duck in that game, bowled by Bill Bowes, the England bowler. But it was the third test match in Adelaide that tensions were at a tipping point, Andrew, especially when there was nearly a potential riot in the third test of the series, with riot police being called at the Adelaide Oval. Australian captain Bill Woodford got hit on the heart while batting. Jardine called out to Larwood and said, "Well bowled, Harold." A move aimed to unsettle Bradman at the non-strikers end at the time. And then it's well known now that MCC manager Plum Warner went into the Australian dressing rooms to see if Woodford was okay, and Woodford reportedly replied, I don't want to see you, Mr. Warner. There are two sides out there. One is trying to play cricket, the other is not. And then it was later reported, he added, the game is too good to be spoiled. It's time for some people got out of it. And also in that test match, Australian wicketkeeper Bert Oldfield got struck on the head while batting in that test match. So thank goodness there wasn't a riot that eventuated from that, but the crowd in Adelaide were not pleased, and that's where tension sort of boiled over there. So Andrew, tell us more about Douglas Jardine. Who was he as a person? And same with Harold Larwood. And how did the two countries go about mending the relationship after Bodyline? Because it was a very difficult period for both Australia and England when Bodyline took place.
Well, you've just given an excellent summary there of Bodyline in Australia. But what you haven't said, and I'll go into detail now, is in fact that the first bit of Bodyline bowling actually took place in Wales. Let's go back to the summer of 1932, and during August, the announcement of the MCC touring party to Australia that winter. Douglas Jardine, as you said, had been appointed captain, and various other members of the team included the Nottinghamshire pair of fast bowlers, Harold Larwood and Bill Vose. Harold Larwood, quite a relatively short, squat figure, but a very fast, very skiddy bowler. Bill Vose as well. Both of them were regarded as the most fearsome fast bowlers on the county circuit. Well, the domestic season finished with a game taking place at Cardiff Arms Park. That's where the rugby ground is now in Cardiff. That's where Glamorgan played from 1921, I should say, till 1966. And the game at the end of the season involved Glamorgan playing against Nottinghamshire. And it was announced in the newspapers that Nottinghamshire would be experimenting with the leg theory bowling, which is what it was talked about then. The leg theory bowling, which they were hoping to use, as you said, to great effect to contain the great Don Bradman. And it was said that the trial of leg theory would take place during Nottinghamshire's visit to Glamorgan. Well, this generated a lot of excitement. And in fact, John Arlott, the doyen of English cricket writers, has written about this as a schoolboy in Basingstoke, riding with a friend by bicycle from his home to the railway station to Reading to catch the Great Western Railway Express to Cardiff. The reason John Arlott as a youngster made the journey was that his hero, his idol as a youngster, was Maurice Turnbull. Now, Maurice Turnbull was the captain of Glamorgan, educated at Cambridge University. He'd made his England Test match debut in 1929, and he, together with another gentleman called Johnny Clay, had turned the club around. It had been a pauper, losing money, but during the 1930s, Maurice Turnbull and Johnny Clay turned the debt-ridden Glamorgan into a cash-making exercise. But turning back to 1932, John Arlott and his friends were fascinated as to how Maurice Turnbull, the England player and the Glamorgan captain, would cope with this hostile fast bowling. Well, I can tell you that Glamorgan ended up scoring one of their highest ever individual scores. Maurice Turnbull made a fantastic double century, and Di Davis, the stalwart batter for Glamorgan, a man who had worked in the steelworks in Llanelli, made a gritty, typical Dower 100 as well, fending off the short pitch bowling that Larwood and Vos sent down. There were lots of other journalists there who were reporting on the effectiveness. Of course, they were thinking that the meek and the callow Glamorgan batters would crumble. But no, as I say, Turnbull, time and again, hooking and square cutting this volley of short pitch bowling. Well, after play, as was obviously the custom in those days, the professional players would meet up in the nearby pubs and taverns in the centre of the town. The amateurs would go and dine in a nearby hotel. And the journalists who were covering the game, both the local journalists as well as the national journalists, were eager to get Larwood and Vos's views on how Bodyline, this short pitch bowling, well, how do you feel when Maurice Turnbull has rattled up almost a double 100 and there's another 100 at the other end? So they were chasing a tail, as it were, as the professionals gathered in the pub. Now, the story goes that the Nottinghamshire players were quite disillusioned by the surface, so they clambered their way back into the Cardiff Arms Park ground. And I think probably the politest way for me to say is they showed their contempt for the pitch by watering it. The story that the Notts players had clambered back into the ground, the news of that reached the ears of Maurice Turnbull, who was the Glamorgan captain, who was dining with Arthur Carr, the Nottinghamshire captain, just in the very nice Grand Hotel opposite the ground. Maurice Turnbull realised that the journalists had picked up on the story, and that was the last thing that they really wanted in the newspapers the following day. So Maurice Turnbull, even though it was now gone 11 o'clock at night, he headed down to the offices of the Western Mail newspaper in the centre of Cardiff. The local journalist, Harry Ditton, had got the story, and it was there, all being typeset back then on the huge metal frames in the printing press at the office of the Western Mail in Cardiff. But Maurice Turnbull persuaded the editor the night editor, I should say, of the newspaper, not to run the story. Well, Harry Ditton had told other journalists about this, and they were hoping the following morning to then be at the ground when Jack Nash, the groundsman at the Arms Park, would take off the covers and maybe some yellowy, orangey stains would appear on the pitch. Well, what had happened, of course, the story hadn't been run, and Maurice Turnbull had gone back to see Jack Nash to make sure that the pitch had been repaired. So all of the watered bits of the pitch had been removed. So when the covers were removed, everything looked in pristine condition. And for many years, that story never saw the light of day. Maurice Turnbull realizing how bad it would be for the image of the game. Now, several journalists instead wrote that if what Maurice Turnbull and Di Davis had done to the Notts bowling for Glamorgan, if the England selectors, if Douglas Jardine had been there at Cardiff to watch what was going on, then maybe Bodyline wouldn't have taken place. I know there were a lot of people who disapproved of the policy, even in domestic cricket, when Bodyline was then subsequently used. Various players got hurt, and it was just looked upon as not being the way to go about things. As you said, the laws of the game were subsequently changed. Now, Larwood and Vos, and to an extent Jardine, was sort of ostracized, and it, by and large, it was through the actions of the other players who realized, well, that's not actually the way we play the game. And an important part in cricket history, body line, an important part leg theory, and certainly a realization that something which is now known as the spirit of cricket. Is it right that you bowl a series of short pitch balls from around the wicket with fielders close in? It's now embraced, I think, in the spirit of cricket, the MCC spirit of cricket. And I think it was a learning lesson for everyone. And again, if, as I say, the stories about 1932, Nottinghamshire playing Glamorgan at Cardiff Arms Park, if people had seen then the way Maurice Turnbull and others dealt with the volley of short pitch bowling, bodyline would never have happened.
Yeah, fascinating listening to that, how bodyline became to be. Do we actually know where the term came from? It wasn't known as bodyline; it was known as leg theory, but it was only bodyline when it after England finished in Australia. Do we know where the term actually came from?
I think it were various people. I think Bruce Harris, one of the journalists who wrote 4 books about it, I think he was one of several journalists who coined the phrase, because clearly the bowlers were aiming for the body rather than the stumps. And that, I believe, is the origin of the word.
Yep. Andrew, let's talk about memories of Ashes cricket and Ashes moments. There's been so many in Ashes cricket over the years, but what are your memories of watching Ashes cricket over the years, growing up, or even now?
Well, as I said, 1968, my earliest Ashes memories there, standing in that department store in Cardiff watching a television set. I suppose I have to, as I mentioned earlier on, one of my boyhood heroes had been Geoff Boycott. So the 1977 series, when Geoff Boycott actually scored his 100th 100. But that would be a personal milestone for Geoff Boycott, on driving Greg Chappell and taking off his cap and receiving the applause. But it was I'll keep the Yorkshire theme going, because I would have to say the 1981 series has a special place in my memories, because I actually went to 2 of the Ashes tests during that series. I went to the game at the Oval. I also went to the game at Edgbaston. And the game, of course, that everyone from the 81 series remembers is the game at Headingley, where Ian Botham, together with the late Graham Dilley, turned things round, and so much has been written. The story, it's part of cricketing legend that England turned the game around. Bob Willis, again, the late Bob Willis, then came steaming in and cleaned up the Australian batters. I have to say, though, that my memories also go to the centenary test in 1977. My memories also link in with the Packer series, World Series cricket. I know that's not Ashes cricket, but I can remember watching some of the games being played in pajamas and in floodlights, and I can remember turning to my parents and saying, that'll never catch on. How wrong I was then. In more recent times, of course, at a personal level, the Ashes series that I worked on in 2009 and again in 2015. I'd have to say the Ashes of 2005, and from a personal point of view, again, one of my friends within the Glamorgan setup being Simon Jones, and purely from a personal point of view, having seen Simon when he first played for Glamorgan in the late 1990s, seeing him go from a young boy into a young man. And then in 2005, seeing him being a member of the Fab Four, So Hogarth, Harmison, Flintoff and Jones, not anything to do with the Beatles, of course, but being a member of the Fab Four, and for Simon to bowl so well, to produce a 6-wicket haul at Old Trafford, and to play his role in an Ashes winning series, absolutely fantastic. Those images of the England team on a open top bus tour through London, the gatherings in Trafalgar Square, some of the other stories which have emanated over time. The 2005 probably would have to be, in modern times, one of the greatest series, certainly in the UK. But more recently, of course, listening to the feats of Ben Stokes, who single-handedly, okay, I know Jack Leach was at the other end, but single-handedly to win a game. My wife and I were driving up from Somerset, and we listening, of course, to the commentary. And we had to pull over onto the hard shoulder to actually listen to the game. We couldn't. It was just, those final couple of overs, and there were so many other people doing the same. And then you could just see the animation, and it was just absolutely astonishing. I'm hoping, of course, that the Ashes series of 2023 will tell another narrative, and there'll be other heroes that the cricket statisticians and historians of the future can celebrate.
Yeah, that's right. Probably writing their chapter in Ashes history, isn't that correct? 2023. It's an opportunity for new players to make their mark on Ashes cricket. There's been so many moments. We've only touched on a few there, but Bob Massey's 16 wickets in 1972 at Lords, Jim Laker taking 90 wickets at Old Trafford in 1956, the great all-rounder from Australia, Keith Miller, taking 10 wickets in 1956, the Battle of the Ridge Test match at Lords in 1961, where Bill Lawry scored 130, facing Statham and Truman. Glenn McGrath taking 8 for 38 in 1997, 500 Test wickets in 2005 at Lords. Both of those achievements. Andrew Flintoff's 5 for 92 in 2009, announced his retirement in that series. We mentioned Headingley 1981, Shane Warne, the late Shane Warne, his hat-trick in Melbourne in 94-95, and the ball of the century, of course, at Old Trafford in 93. Warne and Gatting. Amazing Adelaide, 2006-7, the test match that Australia won from nowhere. And as we mentioned, the Ashes series of 2005. And Richie Benaud, 6 for 70 in 1961 at Old Trafford, bowling Australia to victory and helped Australia retain the Ashes. And as we mentioned, Ben Stokes at Headingley in 2019. So there's so many Ashes moments that we can name, Andrew. But in your opinion, what do you consider to be the greatest Ashes moment, if you had to base it off a historical base?
Wow. Let me give you two answers. I would have to say the Ben Stokes achievement, single-handedly winning a game. But I think if you were to talk to so many people in the UK, that it would be the achievements of Ian Botham and Bob Willis, the England team in the 1981 series, under the captaincy of Mike Brearley. Of course, the early games, it's been very well chronicled what happened in the beginning of the 81 series, and then how things were turned around. Now, I know people in Australia will say, well, how strong was the Australian team? Well, okay, I'll take that, but you can only play what's in front of you. But I would say historically, a team to come back, famously, of course, 500 to 1, to actually have a series that changed so dramatically. I would also say as well, purely from a historical point of view, the TV schedules were completely rearranged. I know during that match, Glamorgan were playing over in Gloucestershire at Bristol. I travelled over by train, and I returned home having listened on the radio to this remarkable transformation. At the time at Bristol, Jarvid Meander and Rodney Ontong were also scoring hundreds for Glamorgan, but it wasn't putting me off too much. And I arrived back home thinking, right, well, I'll stay up to watch the highlights. But the TV schedules, the BBC had actually changed the schedule. So when I arrived at home, my parents were able to tell me, well, don't worry, Andrew, there's this program now with the highlights. It's going to be even earlier. So I think in that context, that has to be a criterion for placing the events of 1981 up there. I know the events of 2005. A lot of people would say, as I mentioned, the celebrations in London afterwards. What I would say is how different everything might have been had at the last afternoon at the Oval, had Shane Warne not dropped Kevin Peterson. And of course, rain did intervene. But there weren't weather interruptions in the 81 series. And certainly as far as Messrs Botham and Willis were concerned, what phenomenal performances. And then for me to go along, as I say, to watch other games and to see Dennis Lilly running in with his yellow bandana and people just chanting and cheering. I would have to say that in 81, Ian Botham's performances inspired so many people and it captured the mood of the nation. Let's not forget that politically, the UK at the time, with inner city riots, unrest, labour concerns, cricket helped to put smiles back on people's faces. And cricket was on the front page of newspapers for all the right reasons.
Absolutely. And Ian Botham was a wonderful cricketer. He could change games like that. Headingley, obviously, for a team to come back after following on, doesn't really happen all that often in Test cricket. We recently saw that with New Zealand and England in that Test match that was played over in New Zealand recently. So it just shows how good of a cricketer he was and how he could change games in just a split second. Who do you think is going to win the Ashes this year, Andrew? Is it going to be a tight series, a close series, or do you think it's going to be a foregone conclusion?
I think it's going to be a very tight series. I'm going to be very intrigued how the much vaunted Australian pace attack cope with what we now know as Bazball. So the going rather than the old boycottian way of grinding out of maybe 50 by mid-afternoon and then maybe knocking off the 100 just before the close of play, but scoring over 350, 400. High octane cricket, playing with freedom. I'm going to be quite intrigued as to how the Australian pace attack cope with that, especially on English pitches. And I will say that there's a lot of confidence. Johnny Bairstow now hoping to be fit. There's a lot of competition for batting places within the England team. I will say I think an awful lot is going to depend on how the English bowlers, Anderson, Broad, Robinson, etc., plus Jofra Archer, how fit they remain. Obviously, Anderson and Broad have had a fantastic career at international level. I think it would be the icing on the cake for them to be part of an Ashes winning series. So I'm just gonna say 2-1 in England's favour, and I hope the celebrations in Trafalgar Square and the open top bus ride is as exciting as it was back in 2005.
Well, me being an Australian fan, of course, I hope that doesn't happen. I hope Australia win the series and retain the Ashes for another consecutive year, as we have for the last few Ashes series. But just one more point and one more question before we wrap up. If England do lose this series by playing Bazball the way they are, and they fail miserably, and they have terrible performances, let's just say, how will that be received by the English public? Because there's been a lot of problems within English cricket in terms of coaching, administrations, and all county cricket or whatever. But more so with Test cricket, that's been in the spotlight. How would that be received if England do not win this Ashes series under Ben Stokes?
Well, that's an interesting question. I think we have to look at it in terms of the bigger picture. That the Australian team, we've seen how they came back under difficult experiences, difficult times in India. I think we would have to set it in context. A lot of people, you're quite rightly, there is a phrase England expects, and a lot of people have been talking up the way the England batters are going to go out. And if there was to be a defeat, well, it's how I think the way you judge it is the way I've been taught, that you treat success and failure the same way. And a measure of the team, a measure of the management, a measure of the leadership would be how they react to it and how they respond. And I think people will be expecting success. If there are weaknesses in the Australian batting, maybe a lot of reliance on my good friend Marnus Labuschagne, hoping that Steve Smith doesn't have as purple a spell. But the younger Usman Khawaja, who of course also played for Glamorgan, a fine opening batter. But I think there's a feeling that if England can get in, let's say reduce Australia to 50 for 3, 50 for 4, I think it could actually be quite a low scoring series, despite the fact we're talking about baseball and going on and getting big scores. If English conditions, if it is going to be, if there are going to be some green tinged pitches with the ball dominating, it could be quite interesting. So you may have to look at the depth of your batting. Hence, when we look at the likes of Ben Foakes, when you look at the likes potentially then of people like Chris Wokes, Ollie Pope, where they all fit in. But I think an awful lot is going to depend on the messages that are given by the England team and as presented by the media. If Australia lose, if England lose and Australia win, well, England haven't got a divine right to hosting the Ashes. And I suppose the message would be, well, let's actually learn from those mistakes. Let's make sure we get it right. And I know you can overanalyze and you can overcomplicate what at the end of the day is quite a simple game between bat and ball. But at the end of the day, I think England certainly have their best chance of recent times if everyone stays fit. And as I say, it's going to be a series that we eagerly anticipate, whether you're in the northern or the southern hemisphere.
Yes, a few late nights for me down here in Australia watching the Ashes in England, as I have done for many years. Even the last Ashes series in 2019, which was a good series, even though Australia didn't win the series, but they got the Ashes back and they retained the Ashes with a drawn series. But it'll be interesting to see who lifts up the urn come the Oval on the final day of the series in June, July, August. It's sure to be a great Ashes series as always. Hi everyone, hope you enjoyed our historical series episode, looking back at the history of cricket with Andrew Hignell, Secretary of the Association of Cricket Statisticians and Historians. If you are interested in becoming a member of the Association of Cricket Statisticians and Historians, head over to their website, which is in the description of this episode.